Karl Marx famously thought that a capitalist economy promotes the systematic exploitation of workers. For Marx, this idea was based on a labor theory of value, which most scholars today reject. Nevertheless, many still agree with Marx's basic claim that capitalism is inherently exploitative. They simply define exploitation in broader and less contentious terms. Instead of thinking about exploitation as involving the forced extraction of surplus value from labor, contemporary philosophers define it as taking unfair advantage of others' vulnerability. And defined in this way, many philosophers think that contemporary capitalism is rife with exploitation, with economically powerful capitalists taking unfair advantage of workers' vulnerability in order to maximize their profit. So, what should we make of this argument? Is capitalism exploitative? And what's the alternative? Well, first, it's absolutely correct that many capitalists want to exploit workers. They want to pay as low a wage as possible and get as much work out of workers as possible in order to maximize profit. But the fact that other capitalists also want to exploit workers in this way makes it difficult for any of them to do so. This is because competitive pressure forces capitalists to pay workers close to the value of what those workers produce, whether they want to or not. If you try to pay someone less than they're worth, someone else will offer them more because they can profit by doing so. Imagine you're in an auction, bidding against others for $1. Of course, you'd like to pay as little as possible for that dollar. But if someone else was bidding 60 cents for it, wouldn't it be worth your while to bid 62? And wouldn't someone else then bid 64 and so on? In a competitive marketplace, that same process leads capitalists to pay workers close to the value of what they produce, not because they want to, but because they have to. The second point to keep in mind about capitalism and exploitation is this. Even when exploitative or unfair exchanges do take place, the institutions of a free market ensure that they will at least usually be mutually beneficial, because the exchanges are voluntary. As an example, think about an exchange that a lot of people find unfair: payday loans. A poor working man needs money right now to meet his basic needs, and so gets a loan from a payday loan store, but only by paying fees equivalent to a 400% annual percentage rate. Let's grant, at least for the sake of argument, that charging such a high interest rate is unfair. Even so, it's important to bear in mind that both parties had the opportunity to say no to the exchange if they believed that they could do better somewhere else. And because of this fact, because the exchange was voluntary in just this very weak sense, this means that both parties expect to gain more from the exchange than they give up. It means that unless one of them has made a mistake, the exchange will be mutually beneficial. This is an important fact. Important for the well-being of individual laborers, and important for the growth and development of society as a whole. Mutually beneficial exchanges are how wealth is created in society. And the more wealth a society creates over time, the less vulnerability there is for capitalists to exploit. Markets aren't perfect. But whether or not you think capitalism is exploitative, you need to ask, what's the alternative? The usual suggestion is political regulation and control. But if our concern is to minimize exploitation, we need to ask whether this alternative really makes sense. After all, citizens are in a position of tremendous vulnerability relative to the state, and lobbyists, bureaucrats, and elected officials will often be tempted to exploit that vulnerability for their own private gain. Think of the way in which our political institutions subsidize large agribusinesses, bail out auto companies, cartelize the banking industry through the Federal Reserve System, and so on. All of these policies benefit the interests of the economically powerful and politically well-connected at the expense of ordinary citizens. That's not a free market at work. That's big government. And politics is unlike markets in that political exchanges aren't voluntary. When the government wants to use your money to bail out GM, you don't have the right to say no. And this means there's no guarantee that the exchange will be mutually beneficial. When politics is involved, one party's gain usually comes at someone else's expense. Politicians gain from the contributions they receive from big business, and big business gains from the favors they receive from government. Sure, those favors have a cost, but because government has the power of coercion, it can force third parties to pay that cost. Those who can afford political influence get the benefits, and those who cannot afford it suffer the consequences. This is how politics works. And it's not because we have bad people in office and need to get nicer people in. It's because of the structural nature of politics. Because the state has the power to impose its decisions by force on the public. Just hoping that the state will use its power on behalf of the vulnerable isn't enough. We need to ask ourselves, if we really want to reduce the amount of exploitation in the world, is increasing the power of the state really the best way to do it?